and say, come on over and be with us. Come on over and be with us. Okay, that's my kind of review of what we have talked about before. Last week we went down through verse 5 of chapter 3. Today I'm hoping we'll get done with verse 10. That's a section, verses 6 through 10. And then go on to verses, the latter part of chapter 3. Okay. We're going to start with verses 4 and 5 that we talked about last week. Because these two verses, especially verse 4, is like a transition. We're going to find there's another transition down in verse 10. Because he's talking to the Christians here in a different style than he did in chapters 1 and 2. To say to them what the truth is, but then he talks about various specific things. In verses 4 through 10, he's talking about sin. And then in verses 11 through about 18 or so of this same chapter, he's going to talk to them about love and what it means. And it's not that complicated. Stay away from sin and love each other. You know, that's pretty much all of this in a couple of words even. These verses in 6 through 10 are among the most misunderstood, misused verses in the whole Bible. So you're going to see we're going to read some interesting things here, aren't we, today? Just like in chapter 2. Remember misunderstood and misused? Antichrist? How the world has taken that word and had it mean what it never, ever, ever has meant. But we're going to run across another thing here in chapter 3. Okay, I'm going to repeat verses 4 and 5 that we talked about last week because they talk about sin. Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. And you know that he appeared in order to take away sin. Who's the he in verse 5? Jesus, yeah. And in him, Christ, Jesus, there is no sin. Okay, I'm going to read verses 6 through 10, and then we'll have fun. 1 John 3, starting at verse 6. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. Little children, let no one deceive you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. The one who practices sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, that he might destroy the works of the devil. No one who is born of God practices sin, because his seed abides in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. By this the children of God and the children of the devil are obvious. Anyone who does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor the one who does not love his brother. As I read through this, can you see where people might have a hard time with some of these verses or come up with some wrong ideas? We're going to do this in 3 parts. One is what it is not teaching. One of them, what it is teaching. A couple of verses here that are significant. And then what is the whole passage really teaching? First of all, what is it not teaching? Can you tell me what it's not teaching just by reading the verses here? Yeah. And the 2 verses that are in particular are verse 6 and verse 9. Okay? No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. Verse 9. No one who is born of God practices sin, because his seed abides in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. There are some folks who have read these verses, and these are the main verses that they will go to say that a Christian doesn't sin. Moreover, a Christian can't sin. Now, before we go any further, how do we know that that can't be true? Actually, lots of places, but I should have more clearly said, how do we know right in 1 John that it can't be true? Yeah, earlier. Honest to goodness, folks, I think you have a really hard time, anybody has a hard time with these verses if you haven't already studied 1 John chapters 1 and 2. Remember back in 1 John chapter 1, verse 8? If we say we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves and the truth is not in us. Verse 10. If we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar and his word is not in us. Was John contradicting himself? No. No. So these verses in 1 John 3 are not saying that Christians don't sin. Because 1 John 1 says very clearly, Christians do sin. And then after verse 10 of chapter 1 is the first verse of chapter 2, where Jesus says, if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous, and he's the one who paid the price for our sins. Notice, our sins. Who's the our here? It's Christians. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 2 don't make any sense unless Christians sin sometimes. Not every day, not every breath. Not everything we do in the world is sin, not at all. So, if it doesn't mean that, we're going to talk about what it means. But let's talk about these verses themselves. No one, verse 6, 1 John 3, 6, it means something. It doesn't mean Christians don't have sins. But what does it mean? I'm going to read 1 John 1, 6 again. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. When you have in English, when you have something like this, can it mean sometimes 2 or 3 different things? Yeah, we know that. Okay? So no one who abides in him sins. In English, sometimes we would say, well, that means he never sins one time, which is what some people teach. But it can also mean he doesn't keep on sinning. Well, can we know for sure which of those possible translations is the correct one? Well, you can know by looking at different translations sometimes. And here in 1 John 1, 6, the translation that I love, mine, is the New American Standard, I don't think has the best translation of this verse. I can't tell you how hard that is for me to say this. Because I really, really love this translation. I grew up on the 1901 American Standard, and then as I realized that the English had changed a lot since 1901 to when I was reading the Bible in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, that's when they came out with the New American Standard, and I switched immediately. Because the old 1901 American Standard had English that was out of date, words that weren't used that way anymore. Okay, but getting back to what it says, how can we know that what it really does mean in 1 John 3, 6? Well, one way is if you don't know Greek. How many here know Greek? Almost none of us. I studied Greek 4 years. I still learn a lot about it. And I'm going to talk to you about the Greek in just a minute. But I don't want to just throw you right into the world of Greek, because people say, yeah, well, how do I know he's telling the truth, If you take another translation, you can see sometimes a better translation of what it is. And the Pew Bible that we have is the New International. And I have a few problems with the New International Version, NIV. But I'm going to say something else here that I thought maybe I would never say in my whole life. The New International Version has a better translation of these verses right in here than the New American Standard. Those words will probably never again come out of my mouth because I really like the New American Standard. And by the way, as we get on this, I'll tell you some reasons why I like the New American Standard. Huh? Yeah, I know it's on the internet, it's on streaming, it's the way it is. You get it out in the world and it comes back to haunt you. By the way, are any translations inspired by God? Are any of the translations in the Bible, did they came straight from God? No. Do all translations maybe have a few mistakes here and there?
I would say all of them.
Huh?
I would say probably all of them.
Yeah. Does that mean we can't trust the Bible? No. It means we have to learn and realize that people are humans and people make mistakes. Okay? Now, I want to read to you these same verses in the New International. If you've got yours, it's on page 1859, the Pew Bible. But I want you to pay attention to, well, I'll just read verses 6 and what's the other one? 6 and 9. I'm going to read just verses 6 and 9. Now remember, well, I'll read them one after another. Okay, in verse 6, I'm going to read you the old King James here in a minute, but in verse 6, mine says, "No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him." Now listen to 1 John 3:6 in the Pew Bible, the New International. "No one who lives in him keeps on sinning. No one who continues to sin has either seen him or known him." Do you hear the difference in these two translations? Remember I said, if you read this in the New American Standard, you could say, well, maybe he's talking about one sin, or sinning ever one time. But when you read the New International, it doesn't say that, does it? It says, no one who lives in him keeps on sinning. No one who continues to sin has either seen him or known him. And 2 times there, it talks about the sin being continual. There's a reason for that in the New International, and that's a really good translation. Now let's go down to verse 9. New American Standard says, "No one who is born of God practices sin." Did you hear that? Practices sin. That's not a one-time thing, is it? Because his seed abides in him, and he cannot sin. Ooh, that sounds like maybe he can't sin at all, because he is born of God. So let's read verse 9 in the New International. "No one who is born of God will continue to sin, because God's seed remains in them. They cannot go on sinning, because they have been born of God." You see the difference there? The New International is a better translation. How can we know, other than a good translation that the guy up front says is the better translation, how can we know? Well, this is where I got to talk to you about Greek just a little bit. In Greek, there are different tenses of verbs, and they're not the same exact tenses that we use in English. What's called the present tense in Greek is an ongoing verb. It says he goes, it means he goes and keeps on going, not just he walks from here to there. If it's called aorist, it means he goes one time from here to there. That's all it means. If it's perfect tense, it's the same thing in the past tense. He went one time. Now, the one time is not in the text, but it's in the verb, because it doesn't mean ongoing, it means one time. It's built into the verb for both the perfect and the aorist. But in the present tense, it means continual. And that's why in these verses, the New American Standard says, again, in verse 6, "No one who lives in him keeps on sinning," because that's present tense. "No one who continues to sin," that's present tense. Verse 9, "No one who is born of God will continue to sin," present tense. Because God's seed remains in him, they cannot go on sinning, present tense. You see what I'm saying? Now, where did people get these incorrect ideas? Got 3 different Bibles up here today. This is my grandmother's Bible, Jewel Brown. A few of you around here knew Jewel Brown very well. And this is her King James Bible. This Bible here is about 80 or 90 years old. But I want to read to you out of the King James, the old King James, not the new King James that a bunch of you have, but the old King James. I want to read these same verses to you out of the old King James, because this was the King James version. This was the version of the Bible for about 100% of Protestants in the 1800s and in the early 1900s. 1 John 3:6 in the King James. "Whoever abideth in him sinneth not. Whoever sinneth has not seen him, neither known him. Does that sound like one time? Yeah. Most ordinary people would read that, says, whoever abides him, he never sins. That's what he's trying to say. Verse 9. Whoever is born of God doth not commit sin, for his seed remaineth in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. He cannot sin. And so people read this in the King James Version in the 1800s and the 1900s, and they said, if you're a Christian, you can't sin. And anybody normally reading this would come to that conclusion. But they might wonder then, well, back in chapter 1, he said that if we say we haven't sinned, we're a liar. And so this was kind of confusing. But they took this the way the King James appeared to say it. And they were mistaken in doing so. The King James was not inspired by God. Some churches teach the King James is inspired by God. Did you know that? Not far from here. If you go down M15, go to Birch Run Road, take a left, a little bit down Birch Run Road going toward Birch Run, you'll see a church building on your right. You just fly right by it. You don't notice the sign. You don't read it. But if you slow down enough to read the sign that they have outside, they have a number of words in that sign. And some of them is King James, right on the sign. In other words, don't bring any other translation into this church or we will tell you to leave. I'm serious. Because they believe that the King James Version of the Bible is inspired by God. They believe it and they teach it. And that's only, 3 miles from here? There are churches that do this. They think the King James is great and wonderful. Does the King James have any mistakes in it? I'm going to just tell you one. Acts 12:4. By the way, is the King James a good translation? Yes. Many times the King James, I think, still has the best wording of a lot of translations, because one of the things that the translators of the King James Version were trying to do was to have a version of the Bible that would be readable with ordinary people. And in the 1600s, did most ordinary people have much of an education? No. There were no free public schools. A lot of people in the 1600s were either illiterate or could barely write their name, and so on. So the King James was written using a lot of short, fairly simple words. And in doing that, and being concise, the way the King James was written, they really wanted it to be understandable by people, ordinary people in the 1600s. Acts 12, verse 4. Oh, well, let me read this from the King James, because that's what I'm talking about. I didn't think about this, so I got to hunt it up here. No, I said it, but I meant Acts 12:4. I'm getting there. This Bible's hard to turn the pages because they stick to each other. Okay, Acts 12:4. It's talking about Herod killing people in the church. Verse 2 says he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And then in verse 3 it says he took Peter and put him in prison. Verse 4, and when he, Herod, had apprehended him, Peter, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Any of you see a problem with that verse? Easter. When did people start observing and using the name Easter? About 1,000 years after Christ. Easter's not in the text in Acts 12:4. Now, there's no definite proof of this, but there's a saying that when King James, King of England, authorized and paid for the translation of the King James Version, that he said to one of the translators, I want Easter in the Bible. Now, what is the word supposed to be here in Acts 12:4? If you go there in any version that you have today, it's going to say the word Passover, which is not the same word as Easter. It's a very different Greek word. In fact, there is no Greek word for Easter because there was no Easter in the first century, period. So when they put the word Easter in Acts 12:4, they made a mistake, and an intentional mistake, so that they could have the word Easter in the Bible. Whether King James told it to do it, we don't have evidence of that, but a lot of people think that. So, yeah, they didn't translate the word baptism because the Church of England sprinkled. And the translators of the King James knew that if they translated it, they would have to translate it immerse. And they weren't going to do that. So they transliterated it. The Greek word is baptisma, and they put it into English as baptism. It's really that simple. It's true. Okay, anyway, let's get back to 1 John. So, what is 1 John 3 saying? He's not saying that people who become Christians don't sin. What is it saying? Well, as I read to you out of the New International Version, they don't keep on sinning. Now, what does that even mean? Don't keep on sinning. It means everybody sins, but you don't just keep on living your life like you were before you became a Christian. You don't keep on just sinning. And that's what the present tense means. You don't just sin. Because when you become a Christian, you say, I don't want to sin anymore. I'm going to try to not sin anymore. I'm committing myself to sinning less. It doesn't mean we become perfect. It doesn't mean we don't sin. Any comments on that? Oh, yeah.
I have one.
Sure.
When I was growing up, we had a gospel meeting every summer, and it lasted about 2 weeks. Well, there was this man in the church, this Bud Foster, and he was a drinker. And he would come to the church every night of the meeting, and at least twice, maybe 3 times, he did this, but he wanted to quit drinking. And I just happened to think of that this week. He just couldn't let it alone.
Yeah. Some people get caught up in a sin so strongly that it becomes their whole life.
He was just as honest as he could be when he came forward. He was crying, and he was just never going to drink again.
But he did. Maybe the same night.
No, he waited.
Waited till the next morning.
As long as he could stand.
Yeah. I talked to you too much about my time at Social Security, but I'm telling you, I had people come in the door and just lie to you, and especially about drugs and alcohol. I can't tell you the number of people came in and I'd say, you've had a problem with alcohol? Yeah, but I haven't drank in a long time. And then 15 minutes later, when they're talking to me, I found out they drank last night. Until they passed out, drank last night. And sometimes they didn't have to tell me that because I'm interviewing them at 9:30 in the morning and they're still drunk. You know. People have a hard time being truthful about things that they don't like or don't want to do or don't want to believe that they do or don't want to admit that they do. And we're all kind of that way. Do you know if you have a little personality problem? I mean, take your pick. Do you get angry real quick and easy and say things you shouldn't say? Do you lie once in a while when it's no reason or just to your advantage or something? Do you have a little personality problem in you? I do. I think most of us have something back there that we don't want to talk about to anybody ever. How hard is it for us to come up and admit that to others or admit it to ourselves? You know? It can be really hard. And it's hard for us to accept that we sin. In our class and in sermons, I've said and other people have said, all Christians sin. Everybody sins in the world. It's old enough to know what they're doing, you know? And you can feel like, oh, wish you hadn't said that. Because that gets personal. That means I sin. Because I don't want to admit I sin. I don't want to admit that I do things that I shouldn't do. And sometimes do them full well knowing I'm doing something I shouldn't do. Now, a silly example of this is, I'm a type 2 diabetic and I got to stay away from sugar. But I'm telling you, about once or twice a year, I'm going to go over to that dairy bar in Otisville and I'm going to get me a cup of butterscotch ice cream and I'm going to eat every bite of it and I'm going to enjoy every bite of it. Now, I'd like to think that's not a sin, but I don't test my blood sugar the next morning because I don't want to see the effect of what I did last night. Now, we're all laughing about that. If I had talked to you about a sin, we probably wouldn't be laughing. You know, sin's hard to deal with, but we all sin. All right? Okay. Any other comments? Like the good fellow there that came and cried his eyes out and he wanted to quit drinking, but he couldn't. Does he have a choice still? He has a choice. But for whatever reason, he has a really hard time making that choice, doesn't he? And that's what Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous is all about, is getting people together who have been in the problem, who know they've got to quit, but they have an extremely hard time quitting. And they have found through AA and NA that if they're around other people who have had the problem and have actually quit, then that's encouraging to them to say that they can quit. It's possible. But there's a lot of people like this fellow here who believe that I'm a drunk and I'm going to live a drunk and I'm going to die a drunk, and that's all there is to it. It isn't all there is to it, but that's what he thinks. It's really hard to quit some sins. And they don't have to be drunkenness or they don't have to be drugs. It can be telling lies. You probably been around a person that just tells lies all the time. Their first nature is to tell a lie for maybe no reason. Okay, we could talk about that on and on. Any comments? Yeah, we're going to be done in 6 minutes, and I haven't even gotten halfway through this yet. Oh, Lord. Okay, what is it saying? I'm going to read out of my translation, New American Standard. Everyone who practices sin also that's verse 4. Also practices lawlessness, sin is lawlessness. And you know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one abides in him sins, meaning doesn't keep on sinning. No one who sins, keeps on sinning, has seen him or knows him. Little children, let no one deceive you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. The one who practices sin is of the devil, for the devil is sin from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, that he might destroy the works of the devil. No one who is born of God practices sin, that says continual, because his seed abides in him and he cannot sin, meaning he cannot keep on sinning because he is born of God. By this the children of God and children of the devil are obvious. Anyone who does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor the one who does not love his brother. He's saying that when we become Christians, we turn away from our old life, and we commit ourselves to not living that way anymore or as much as we're able to. But the Gnostics were saying it's okay to keep on sinning. It's okay. Back toward the beginning, 8 or 9 weeks ago, we talked about how did they justify this. Because they knew that John said in 1 John that, if we say we have no sin, we're liars. They say, well, you see, the body sins, but not the mind. The body is going to go back to the dust, but the mind's going to go to heaven. So the body sins, but I'm okay because it's just in my mind. And by the way, there are still some churches today that teach that exact thing. I haven't run across this in Michigan, but down in the South, there were some Baptist churches that taught exactly what I just said. That the body sins, the body goes to dust, the mind doesn't sin, the mind goes to heaven. The soul goes to heaven. Kind of good. It sounds like you can have your cake and eat it too, doesn't it? You know? But what John is saying here in 1 John is, you can't do that. That's why he says so many times. Verse 8, the one who practices sin is of the devil. Verse 10, anyone who does not practice righteousness is not of God. Verse 4, everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness. He's saying if we keep on sinning, even though we say we're a Christian, and it's just a regular part of our life to sin, and we think we're okay, we're not okay. That's what he's saying right here. That's what this passage is all about. Any comments on that? And as we've said before, when Christians do sin, even though we don't want to and we know it's wrong, our sins are washed away. That's what 1 John 2, verse 1 and 2 say. Christ is the propitiation for our sins. Who's the our in 1 John? O-U-R in 1 John 2:2. Christians' sins. And not for ours only, but also for those of the whole world. Christ takes away the sins of Christians like Christ takes away the sins of non-Christians.
It was a pretty attractive doctrine. It was attractive back then, but it was attractive today too. We like the idea that
Yeah.
there was a fault, or it's just the flesh sinning, but it doesn't corrupt my spirit. So it's, I mean, it's worth reading something that happened a couple thousand years ago, but it hadn't gone away. It's just we don't necessarily know the word doctrine.
Right.
We know the doctrine.
The largest church that teaches you become a Christian, you don't sin, is the Southern Baptist Church. They only have about 15 million people. And I lived in the South, and I was around these people all the time. And I heard them say, I became a Christian, I don't sin. And they meant it. I became a Christian, I don't sin. Can you see a little problem with that? Huh? Well, maybe he really believes it. I mean, the ones that were talking to me, boy, they were sincere. The problem with it is, what happens when a person in your church sins? And it's clear, obvious, known. Do you know what the Southern Baptist answer to that question is? He never was a Christian. He never really was saved. They teach once saved, always saved as an assurance of salvation. But the reality in that teaching is that if you sin one time, that's proof to you that you've never even been a Christian, that you've never been saved at all. How discouraging is that? So what do people do? They either hide their sins or they deny their sins.
And I was just going to say, I mean, we all know people who are members of other faith, and they deeply love the Lord. They don't live like, well, okay, I got this get out of jail free card, I'm going to go do anything I want. They're very dedicated.
Yes, they are.
But you're right. It's a quandary when you interpret it this way and then you see something.
It's a contradiction. And what about a good person that believes this and then they know they've done a sin that nobody else knows? If they're going to follow the consequences of their own church's teaching, they're going to have to say, I'm not really a Christian. I've never been saved. I'm still lost. Even if nobody else knows. That's a really hard thing to carry around inside yourself. But as we all know, there are people who say, I don't sin, I never sin, until one day they get caught, and then what do they do then? Well, let's talk about Jimmy Swaggart. Remember old Jimmy Swaggart? Jimmy Swaggart had his television program operating out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And there's a little bit, phooey, it's 15 till and I got to stop. Okay, I'm going to talk about Jimmy Swaggart next week. Rats. That 6 minutes went by faster than I thought it would. But you know what I'm going to say. Jimmy Swaggart said he never sinned, and then one day, oops, it was on television. With video. We'll talk about that next week. A little bit. And then we will go on maybe to verse 11 in chapter 3. Thank you for your kind attention.